Hi everyone, my name is Maddie and we're going to be reading The Adventures of Pinocchio by Carlo Collodi. Chapter 1. An Unusual Piece of Wood. Once there was a piece of wood that was unlike any other. At first, it didn't seem different from any piece of wood that you would use to burn in wintertime stoves or fireplaces. Mr. Antonio, who was called Mr. Cherry because of the bright red tip of his nose, chose that piece of wood to make a new leg for his table. He soon learned just how different a piece of wood it was. With his axe held high overhead, Mr. Cherry was just about to hit the log when he heard a voice. "Please don't hit me too hard," it begged. Mr. Cherry looked around the room. No one was there. He looked under the workbench and in the cupboard. No one was there. He looked in a basket of wood shavings and sawdust. Still, he found no one. He even opened the door to the shop and looked up and down the street. No one was there. "Oh, I must be imagining things," he said as he raised the axe again. When he brought the axe down, it hit the wood just where he wished, splitting the log. "That hurt!" cried the same voice from before. Mr. Cherry was suddenly afraid. His jaw hung wide open, and his tongue stuck out of his mouth. "Is it possible that this piece of wood can speak and feel and cry like a child?" he wondered. "I don't believe it. Perhaps someone is inside of the wood. If there is, I'll teach him a lesson." Mr. Cherry struck the wood against the walls and waited to see if the voice spoke again. It didn't, so he picked up the plane to begin to shape the wood to make the table leg. As he slid the plane over the piece of wood, it began to jiggle and wiggle in his hands. "Stop! Stop! You're tickling me!" the wood laughed. Mr. Cherry fell to the floor in shock. When at last he sat up again, his face, even his red nose, was blue with fright. It was a very unusual piece of wood indeed. Before Mr. Cherry could think of what to do, there was a knock at the door. "Come in," he called from where he was sitting on the floor. Geppetto, the old woodcarver, walked into the shop. Although his name was Geppetto, the neighborhood boys often called him Polenta, because Geppetto's yellow wig reminded the boys of a kind of porridge made from cornmeal. It was a nickname that drove him wild. "Good morning, Mr. Cherry," Geppetto said. Why are you sitting on the floor?" "I'm giving the ants a lesson about the alphabet," Mr. Cherry said. "What can I do for you today?" The carpenter got up off the floor as Geppetto explained his visit. "I want to make a wooden puppet that will be able to dance and do somersaults. I'm going to take it around the world so I can earn my living. How does that sound?" Geppetto asked. "Good idea, Polenta," was the response. The voice didn't come from Mr. Cherry, but Geppetto thought that it had. Geppetto was enraged that his good friend would call him by that awful nickname. "Why have you insulted me?" asked Geppetto. "It wasn't me," Mr. Cherry said. "Yes, it was," Geppetto said. "No," Mr. Cherry said. Soon the old friends were wrestling. When they were through, Geppetto had Mr. Cherry's gray wig in his teeth, and Mr. Cherry was wearing Geppetto's yellow wig. Regaining their senses, they each gave each other back their wigs. They made a promise not to ever have such a quarrel again. "Now, Geppetto, what can I do for you?" Mr. Cherry asked. "I want a piece of wood to make my new puppet. Do you have one?" he asked. At once, Mr. Cherry went to get the talking piece of wood that had startled him earlier. Just as Mr. Cherry was about to hand the wood to Geppetto, it began to shake wildly in his hands. As it did, it struck poor Geppetto in the shins. "Ouch! You clumsy ox! What did you do that for?" Geppetto asked. "I didn't do anything. It was the wood," Mr. Cherry said. Geppetto and Mr. Cherry went at it again. Each accused the other until they were wrestling on the floor of the woodworking shop again. After the battle, Mr. Cherry had a few scratches on his nose, and Geppetto had lost a few buttons from his sweater. They shook hands and again promised never to get into such an argument. Geppetto got to his feet, picked up the piece of wood, and walked home.